I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and my friend was saying that I should debate you, but really I was just trying to get an understanding of the, what do you call it, the monarchical Trinitarian view, or something like that. But it sounded like you had other things that you wanted to debate about Mormonism or whatever.
We can debate whatever you want. I don't care. We could talk about Trinity, or we could debate Mormonism, whatever you want.
Yeah, honestly, I don't have many issues with the Orthodox. I think they're closer than everyone else. We're in agreement on like grace versus works. It sounds like we're in agreement on rejecting Thomism, however you pronounce that. A lot of stuff like that. And so I don't dislike any of my Orthodox guys, and I don't have enough of a knowledge of their doctrine to have issues with it.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
One of the things that I think is probably just on the surface, one of the most maybe difficult elements for me in terms of what I'm not an expert on Mormonism. Over the years, I've done a decent amount of research. I've read Talmage, one of your systematic theologians, and other kind of older texts from Brigham Young and Joseph Smith, and Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price, various sermons that Smith gave over the years. But I think one of the most difficult things for me to understand is the added sections where Joseph Smith added about 13 or 12 or 13 verses to Genesis 50, which included himself being prophesied in the book of Genesis. To me, that on the surface just completely destroys this entire religion.
The Joseph Smith translation was not necessarily intended to be like, oh, this was actually in Genesis, or even necessarily like, this is canon.
Okay, so I can add to the Bible and present it as if it's a prophecy. I mean, you understand these verses are intended to predict and prophesy Joseph Smith.
You absolutely can, and this is something that the Book of Mormon talks about, where Nephi is reading in Isaiah, and he says, well, I read this and I liken the scriptures unto myself. So he tries to find himself in the scriptures and let God teach him new things about himself or about God from the scriptures, rather than seeking a strictly
are you aware of the way that, for example, Muslims do this with Muhammad in the book of John or in Deuteronomy, that those passages are prophesying Muhammad?
But they don't necessarily. But like, we don't use the Joseph Smith translation as like evidence.
It doesn't matter whether you use it now, because it's evidence of a con man. He's a fraud.
You could say it like that, but you could also say, well, an actual prophecy would look like that way too, right? Like,
no, actual prophets don't add themselves 1,800 years later to the text.
Any Jew reading the book of Matthew would say these are clearly the apostles retroactively reading prophecies about Jesus Christ.
Not at all. Totally not true. Number one, it wouldn't matter what Jews say, but that's not at all. That's the argument Jesus himself makes, not the Pharisees. It's Jesus saying that these Old Testament passages predict me. Totally different than retroactively saying 1,800 years later, the book of Genesis, which actually is thousands of years later, retroactively, the book of Genesis predicted Joseph Smith. That's preposterous.
So Jesus saying 1,800 years earlier, Moses predicted me.
Are you aware of what the Gospel of John says? Jesus doesn't just say those books predicted me. He says, I spoke through those prophets.
Sure, yes. But
no, that's not the same. What did I just say? What did I just say?
You said that Jesus said he spoke through the prophets.
Does Jesus say that?
Even before. What?
Does Jesus claim that in the Gospels?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's different than, that's totally different than what you're talking about.
Well, again, for a Jew who rejects Jesus Christ,
that's a fallacy. Do you understand how dumb this argument is? Jews reject the Book of Mormon.
Sure.
So what the heck does Jews have to do with anything? That's a stupid argument. That's a dumb argument. What does Jews have to do with anything?
I'm saying that the same principle by which you're discounting.
No, you're using a fallacy. It's not the same principle. You're way off. retroactively saying 1,800 years later.
Well, whatever you think it is, like the same logic could be used by someone who is inclined to argue against Christ.
No, it couldn't. That's the false equivalence. You don't see the difference there?
1 second, I'm cutting out.
If Joseph Smith said, I was predicted in the book of Genesis because I spoke. Yeah. If Joseph Smith said, I was predicted in the book of Genesis because my spirit.
Test.
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, I'm back.
Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah,
can
I
you
can
hear
hear
me?
you.
Okay. So if Joseph Smith.
Again, I'm not saying like.
Dude, stop for a second. Stop for a second, okay? Let's walk through this. If Joseph Smith said, I spoke through the spirit that was speaking in Genesis. It was my spirit speaking in Genesis to predict me.
Okay, obviously Joseph Smith.
Shut up, man. Well, you're not going to stop talking when I'm explaining this to you. Why do you keep interrupting? Let me
continue. Right?
Why is this funny?
I'm hearing you out.
Yeah, but you're giggling. Why are you giggling? Are you giggling at the idiocy of Mormonism?
Snorting at
I mean, I would be giggling too if I was a Mormon because all this stuff is completely stupid. So again, if Joseph Smith said, "I am speaking through Genesis," that would be
obviously
all right. If you don't stop,
I understand.
If you don't stop talking over me and interrupting, we're done. That's just so stupid. You want to call back in and try to get a better connection because I think there's a delay. You're welcome to call back in and try again, but it's just, I'm not going to talk to somebody who talks every 2 seconds. No, there's not an equivalence between Jesus saying, I spoke through Moses. All of the revelation in Genesis is about me because I was the one speaking through all of those texts. Peter says it was the Spirit of Christ that prophesied through the Old Testament. That's not the same thing as Joseph Smith saying, I'm going to add verses to the book of Genesis that predict me. That's a totally false equivalence. That's how stupid this is. Are we going to try the Mormon guy again? If maybe he's got a better connection, there's not a delay. What's up, man? You there? You want to unmute?
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry.
Okay, so let me restate what I was trying to argue to you. It's a false equivalence to say that because Jesus says, I'm the one that spoke through all those prophets in the Old Testament, that's not the same thing as Joseph Smith saying, oh, let me add a few verses to the last chapter of Genesis to predict me. That's a false equivalence. Very different.
Okay, so you're saying like the problem is adding scripture, right?
Well, it's not just that, but it's also a con man element that obviously nothing in the book of Genesis is talking about Joseph Smith. And what he's doing is, because the last chapter is about Joseph the patriarch, he's tagging himself in there because it says Joseph.
Sure.
Sure. You're okay with that?
Yeah.
All right. Well, then, I mean, if it's okay to be a con man and be a fraud, then we can all do that.
No, not to be a con man or a fraud,
but that is what that is. Do you think Genesis is talking about? You admitted Genesis is not talking about Joseph Smith, right?
Not in the text we have, no. But
then that's a con man fraud operation.
It can be, but again, non-Christians would accuse the Christians.
This is do you know what a fallacy is? Do you know what a fallacy is?
Yeah, of course.
What's a fallacy?
Formal or informal?
Informal's fine.
Informal is two logical propositions that do not necessarily lead to the conclusion.
Right. So the fact that people in other religions don't accept Jesus's claims has nothing to do with whether or not Joseph Smith's adding verses makes him still a potential prophet. Those are totally disconnected. What does the attitude of Jews have to do with this?
It's just that they use the same argument, right?
So what? How does that make it a good argument?
I don't know. You think it's a good enough argument to use against Joseph Smith, right?
No, I just showed you that it's a false equivalence. It's not the same thing.
It's not quite the same thing.
No, it's totally different. Jesus is not just saying that, let me retroactively find a few verses that might hint at me. He's saying, I literally spoke the entire Old Testament. Peter says that it was the Spirit of Christ who spoke through all the Old Testament prophets. Joseph Smith is not doing that. Joseph Smith is saying the last chapter of Genesis, it's about the patriarch Joseph. Oh, by the way, here's 10 extra verses about me, Joseph. That's fraud, conman stuff.
Maybe Joseph did have such a prophecy in Genesis, unless you think it's a full account of everything that happened in his life.
You just admitted a minute ago that Genesis is not talking about Joseph Smith.
Yes, because it's not a full account.
A full account? It has nothing to do with Joseph Smith.
I do not know whether Joseph in Egypt had a personal prophecy about Joseph Smith.
You just admitted that Joseph Smith added those verses, and you said we don't have to accept that as a Mormon. Now you're trying to say, well, maybe it can be counted. So you're flip-flopping.
No, please listen. I don't know whether Joseph had this prophecy, that Joseph in Egypt had
You just said a minute ago that you don't have to believe those as a Mormon, did you not?
Yes.
And now you're flipping the argument and saying that, well, maybe actually Joseph did have a prophecy of Joseph Smith.
Okay, how is that different from we don't have to believe it?
Because now you're admitting that it was a prophecy when a minute ago you said that Joseph Smith might have actually just added those things. Which one is it?
You haven't let me finish.
No, you've contradicted. Which one is it?
You haven't let me finish.
You're moving the goalpost in the middle of the argument. Which one is it?
Personally, I would say, if you'd let me finish, that it was Joseph likening the scriptures unto himself and God kind of speaking to him as if this was true scripture and using it to teach Joseph Smith something about Joseph Smith. Not necessarily
this is
a
completely
prophecy.
stupid. All right, we're out of here. We're done. This is the dumbest shit I've ever heard. Later. Yeah, goodbye. It literally changed the argument, right? So when the first argument that, look, Mormons don't have to believe this could be Joseph Smith just being creative and kind of retroactively finding himself in the Old Testament. Excuse me? Finding himself in the Old Testament? Retroactively? And then he flips it and says, well, it actually could be a prophecy of him. Now, which one is it? You said 10 minutes ago you don't have to believe it. It's just Joseph Smith being creative in a retroactive prose way. Oh, now it's actually a prophecy, and the patriarch Joseph was predicting Joseph Smith. So you just contradicted yourself.